Imagine a silence so absolute it could crush the spirit of a kingdom, a stillness that preceded not peace, but the potential extinction of a culture. In the autumn of 1480, the Ugra River was a ribbon of silver-gray water cutting through the dense, darkening woods of central Russia. On the northern bank stood the men of Moscow, their iron mail shirts catching the pale, weak sunlight of a dying year. On the southern bank, stretching back into the horizon until they merged with the swaying tall grass of the Great Steppe, were the Tumans of the Great Horde. For centuries, the world had known a single terrifying truth. When the horsemen of the east arrived, the earth trembled and the cities of the Rus burned. But here, on the banks of a river nicknamed the Girdle of the Virgin, the gears of history were beginning to grind against one another, threatening to snap. This was not a sudden clash of steel, but a slow-motion collision of two worlds. To the south lay the fading echoes of Genghis Khan's empire, a sun setting in a sea of blood. To the north lay the rising ambition of Moscow, a young power that had spent 200 years learning how to survive in the shadow of giants. They called it the Great Stand on the Ugra River, and before the autumn frost turned to thick ice, the fate of Eurasia would be decided not by a grand charge, but by the excruciating pressure of waiting. To appreciate the gravity of 1480, one must first understand the suffocating weight of the Mongol yoke. Since the mid-13th century, the Russian principalities had been little more than a collection of tax districts for the Golden Horde. When Batu Khan's armies swept across the plains in 1240, they didn't just conquer, they dismantled the very concept of Russian sovereignty. Kiev, the mother of cities, was reduced to a smoking ruin with barely 200 houses left standing. For over 2 centuries, the Grand Princes of Russia were forced to travel thousands of miles to the Khan's headquarters at Sarai, or even further to Karakorum, to crawl on their knees and beg for the Yarlik, the patent of office that allowed them to rule their own people. They paid the vikad, a crushing annual tribute of silver, fur, and grain, collected by the Boskoks, the Khan's ruthless tax collectors. If a prince resisted, a punitive expedition followed, leaving nothing but charred timber and skeletons. This was the world into which Ivan III was born. He was not a warrior king in the traditional romantic sense. He was something far more dangerous, a cold, methodical administrator. He was a man who preferred a ledger to a lance, a man who understood that an empire is built as much with ink and patience as it is with blood. By the time he ascended the throne in 1462, the Golden Horde was no longer the monolithic terror it had once been. It had fractured into competing khanates, Kazan, Astrakhan, Crimea, and the Great Horde. But to the Russians, even a wounded predator remained a predator. Ivan III, later known as Ivan the Great, began a quiet, relentless campaign to gather the Russian lands. He annexed Yaroslav, he bullied Rostov, and in a shocking display of power, he brought the merchant republic of Novgorod to its knees. But as his borders expanded, the shadow of the Horde remained. The Great Horde was now led by Akhmat Khan, a man desperate to restore the glory of his ancestors. Akhmat saw the rising power of Moscow not as a peer, but as a rebellious servant who had grown too fat and too bold. The tribute, once a steady stream of wealth flowing south, had become a trickle. By the mid-1470s, Ivan III had done something unthinkable. He simply stopped paying. Legend tells of a dramatic moment when the Khan's envoys arrived in Moscow, carrying the basma, a wax tablet bearing the Khan's seal and an image of his face. The protocol demanded that the Grand Prince meet the envoys on foot, drink mare's milk, and prostrate himself before the tablet. Instead, Ivan reportedly took the tablet, spat upon it, and smashed it to the ground. He then ordered the execution of all the envoys, save one, whom he sent back to Akhmat with a message. Tell your master that what happened to his image will happen to him if he bothers me again. While modern historians debate the theatricality of this event, the political reality was clear. Moscow had declared independence. Akhmat Khan could not let this insult stand. To do so would be to admit that the Great Horde was a ghost of its former self. He began mobilizing his forces, calling in favors across the steppe. He also looked westward, seeking an alliance with King Kazim IV of Poland and Lithuania. This was the ultimate nightmare for Moscow, an encirclement. If the heavy cavalry of the Horde attacked from the south, while the professional infantry of Lithuania struck from the west, Moscow would be crushed between two millstones. Ivan, however, was playing a deeper game. He sent his own envoys to the Crimean Khanate, the Great Horde's bitterest rival. He forged a secret alliance with Menli I Girai, the Crimean Khan, ensuring that if Akhmat moved toward Moscow, the Crimeans would strike at Akhmat's rear or distract the Lithuanians. It was a geopolitical chessboard of staggering complexity, and the pieces were finally moving. In the spring and summer of 1480, the tension reached a breaking point. Akhmat Khan began his slow, deliberate march northward. He didn't take the direct route toward Moscow, which was heavily fortified along the Ugra River. Instead, he swung westward, moving through the lands of his Lithuanian ally, hoping to link up with Kazim's army. Ivan, alerted by his scouts, moved his own forces to block the path. But as the Grand Prince prepared for war, his own house began to crumble. His brothers Boris and Andrei rose in open rebellion, furious over the distribution of land and power. They withdrew their support and moved their troops away, leaving Ivan's flank exposed and his capital vulnerable. The doves in Ivan's court, led by wealthy boyars who feared the destruction of their estates, whispered in his ear, begging him to flee, to pay the tribute, to beg for mercy. They reminded them of the horrific massacre of 1382, when Tokhtamysh Khan had burned Moscow to the ground, despite a Russian victory only 2 years prior. The pressure on Ivan was immense. He was a man who hated the physical risks of battle, often staying in the rear, earning him the sneering nicknames of the cowardly from his detractors. Yet Ivan stayed his course. He fortified the city of Moscow, sending his wife, the Byzantine princess Sophia Paleologina, away to the safety of the north, along with the state treasury. He then rode out to the Ugra River to join his son, Ivan the Young, and his seasoned generals. But as the scouts reported Akhmat's movement toward the Ugra, Ivan realized the Oka was no longer the front line. The Ugra was a smaller river, but it represented the last natural barrier between the horde and the heart of Russia. If Akhmat crossed it, the road to Moscow was wide open. Ivan moved his army with a speed that surprised his enemies, reaching the northern bank of the Ugra just as the first dust clouds of the Mongol vanguard appeared on the southern horizon. The air was turning cold. The river, barely 100 yards wide in some places, was the only thing separating the past from the future. Akhmat's forces were vast, tens of thousands of horse archers, their colorful banners snapping in the wind, their campfires lighting up the night like a fallen galaxy. On the other side, the Russians dug in, placing their early primitive cannons and long-range crossbowmen at the shallowest points. They were outnumbered, divided by internal strife, and abandoned by their allies. The arrows began to fly, hissing across the water like angry hornets. The great stand had begun.
The initial volley was met not with a retreat, but with the thunderous, earth-shaking roar of the Muscovite artillery. These primitive cannons, known as tufiaks, were more terrifying for their noise and smoke than their accuracy, yet at such close range they proved devastating. As the Mongol horsemen attempted to urge their mounts into the freezing currents of the Ugra, the banks exploded in a cacophony of iron and stone shot. The water, clear and cold just moments before, began to churn with the frantic splashing of wounded horses and the dark, spreading stain of blood. This was not the wide open battlefield of the steppe where the Golden Horde's superior mobility could encircle an enemy. Here, the geography dictated the terms of the engagement. The Ugra was a serpentine barrier, its banks often steep and muddy, leaving only a handful of shallow fords where a crossing was even possible. At each of these paravozes, the Russian forces had established fortified positions, turning the natural bottlenecks into killing zones. Ivan III, positioned a short distance back from the immediate front at the village of Kremenets, found himself in a profound psychological isolation. History often paints him as a grand strategist, but in the autumn of 1480, he was a man paralyzed by the weight of 1,000 years of subjugation. To his left and right, his advisors were split into two warring factions of council. Some, the older boyars who remembered the devastating raids of the past, urged him to flee or negotiate. They reminded him of the terrible fate of those who had defied the Khans in previous centuries, speaking in hushed, fearful tones of the burning of Moscow under Tokhtamysh. They argued that the Great Yoke was a divinely ordained punishment that could only be endured, not broken. To them, Ivan's defiance was not bravery, but a reckless gamble with the lives of millions. Others, the younger warriors and the fierce leaders of the church, demanded blood and iron. They saw the Ugra not just as a river, but as a baptismal font for a new, independent Russia. Chief among these voices was Archbishop Vasyan of Rostov, a man whose rhetoric was as sharp as any Tatar saber. Vasyan was horrified by Ivan's perceived hesitation. He saw the Grand Prince's tactical withdrawal to Kremenets, intended to create a more flexible defensive line, as a sign of cowardice. The Archbishop penned the Epistle to the Ugra, a document that would become one of the most significant pieces of political propaganda in Russian history. In it, he did not mince words. He called Ivan a fleeing shepherd and reminded him of his sacred duty to protect his flock. He invoked the memory of the saints and the glory of the battlefield at Kulitovo, urging Ivan to stand firm against the godless sons of Hagar. While the spiritual and political battle raged in Ivan's tent, the physical battle on the riverbanks remained a grinding stalemate. For 4 days, from October 8th to the 11th, Akhmat Khan launched wave after wave of attacks. His horse archers would ride to the water's edge, leaning low over their horses' necks to unleash a storm of arrows intended to clear the Russian embankments. But the Russians were well protected behind wooden pavises and earthen berms. More importantly, the Muscovite pishchalniki, the early musketeers and the crossbowmen, maintained a disciplined rate of fire. The Mongol arrows, though numerous, lacked the kinetic energy to penetrate the Russian defenses from across the river, while the Russian bolts and lead shot tore through the light armor of the steppe warriors. Akhmat was growing increasingly frustrated.
He had expected a swift victory, a repeat of the glorious conquests of his ancestors. He had counted on the internal divisions within the Russian camp to weaken their resolve. More importantly, he was waiting for an ally who had yet to appear, King Casimir IV of Poland and Lithuania. The plan had been simple and lethal. The horde would strike from the south, while the Lithuanians would strike from the west, crushing Muscovy in a pincer movement. But the horizon to the west remained empty. Unbeknownst to Akhmat, Ivan had played his own diplomatic trump card. He had formed a secret alliance with Mengli Gire, the Khan of the Crimean Tartars. While Akhmat sat on the Ugra, Mengli Gire's forces were savaging the southern borderlands of Lithuania, forcing Casimir to keep his armies at home to defend his own territory. The pincer had been broken before it could even close. As the middle of October approached, the nature of the war began to change. The frantic skirmishes at the fords gave way to a tense, watchful silence. The weather, that eternal arbiter of Russian history, began to turn. The vibrant golds and reds of autumn forests faded into the gray, skeletal architecture of early winter. The first frosts arrived, silvering the tall grass and turning the muddy banks into treacherous frozen ruts. For Akhmat, the cooling temperatures were a double-edged sword. On one hand, the freezing of the river would remove the Russians' greatest defensive advantage. Once the Ugra was covered in a thick sheet of ice, his cavalry could cross anywhere, bypassing the fortified fords and swarming the Russian positions. On the other hand, the cold was a death sentence for his logistical tail. The Great Horde was a nomadic city on the move, consisting of tens of thousands of people and hundreds of thousands of horses, sheep, and camels. They lived off the land, but the land along the Ugra had already been picked clean. The grass that fed their horses was dying or buried under the first light dustings of snow. The Russians' scorched earth tactics had left no grain or hay for miles. While Ivan's army was being supplied by the nearby heartlands of Muscovy, Akhmat's men were beginning to starve. The cold seeped into their felt tents, and the lack of fodder began to claim the lives of the horses, the very source of the horde's power. Across the water, the Russians watched the smoke from the Mongol fires. The psychological tension was reaching a breaking point. Ivan was still being haunted by the specter of a full-scale Mongol breakthrough. He knew that the ice was coming. In a move that nearly caused a mutiny among his more aggressive commanders, he ordered a general retreat from the riverbank back toward the town of Borovos. His logic was sound, if agonizingly cautious. If the river froze, the current positions would be death traps. By moving back to Borovos, he could force the Mongols to fight on a field of his choosing, where his infantry and artillery could be concentrated. But to the common soldier and the terrified citizens of Moscow, this looked like a retreat. Panic began to spread. The bells of Moscow rang in constant prayer, and many feared that the Grand Prince was preparing to abandon the capital. Yet on the southern bank, Akhmat Khan was not celebrating. He saw the Russian withdrawal not as a sign of weakness, but a potential trap. He was a man of the steppe, and he feared the deep, dark forests of the Russian interior, where his horses would be useless. He also received intelligence that a Russian raiding party, led by the daring Prince Vasily Nostrovdy and the Crimean Prince Nordevlet, had sailed down the Volga to attack the horde's home capital of Sarai. While Akhmat sat on the Ugra, his own heartland was being put to the torch. The standoff had become a game of chicken played on a continental scale. Two civilizations stood on the precipice, each waiting for the other to blink. The Ugra, now sluggish and choked with floating chunks of ice, flowed between them like a funeral shroud. The air was so cold that the breath of men and horses hung in the air like ghostly spirits. It was in this frozen silence that the true turning point of the Great Stand would occur, not through a grand charge or heroic sacrifice, but through the slow, inexorable realization that the world had shifted beneath their feet. The ice began to knit itself across the surface of the Ugra, a bridge forged by nature that neither king nor Khan could control. It was the end of October, and the final act was about to begin.
The ice did not merely form, it conquered. It began as a delicate crystalline fringe along the muddy banks, a lace of frost that seemed too fragile to hold the weight of a bird. But as the Siberian winds roared across the open steppe, those fragile needles lengthened and thickened, interlocking into jagged sheets. The Ugra, once a churning defensive moat that sang with the rush of autumn rains, grew muffled. The gurgling of the water beneath the thickening crust sounded like a heartbeat slowing to a stop. By the first days of November, the Belt of the Virgin, as the Russians called the river, had become a solid, translucent floor. The barrier that had protected the Grand Duchy of Moscow for months had vanished, replaced by a highway of white stone. In the camp of Grand Prince Ivan III, this transformation was met with a chilling sense of exposure. For weeks, the Russian strategy had been anchored to the geography of the river. Their superior cannons and long-range arquebuses had turned the narrow fords into killing zones. But on a frozen river, the Mongol cavalry, the legendary horsemen of the Golden Horde, would not be funneled into narrow crossings. They could charge in a thundering wave across a front miles wide. The technological advantage of the Russian gunpowder was suddenly threatened by the sheer kinetic potential of a massed cavalry charge on an open plain of ice. Ivan III, often criticized by his contemporaries as cautious or even timid, was a man who played the long game of survival. He understood that a single pitched battle, lost in the frozen wastes of the Ugra, would mean the end of Moscow and the re-enslavement of his people. Seeing the ice hardened, he made a decision that sent shockwaves through his officer corps. On November 7th, he ordered his army to strike their tents and withdraw. He did not order a charge, he ordered a retreat to the town of Kremenetsk, and later toward Borovosk. To the common soldier and the hot-blooded boyars, this felt like a betrayal. They had stood in the mud and the sleet for weeks, watching the horde's campfires across the water, only to be told to turn their backs when the enemy finally had a path to reach them. Whispers of cowardice began to circulate. It was said that Ivan was terrified, that he was preparing to flee to the northern forests and leave the heart of Russia to be trampled by Akhmat's hooves. Even the church, usually a pillar of support for the Grand Prince, was incensed. Archbishop Vesian Rillo of Rostov penned a scathing letter to Ivan, comparing him to a shepherd who deserts his flock when the wolf appears. "You have surrendered the honor of the Russian land," the letter implied, urging Ivan to stand like a martyr rather than retreat like a thief in the night. Yet Ivan's retreat was not a flight of panic. It was a cold, calculated repositioning. By moving to the heights of Kremenetsk, he was forcing Akhmat Khan to make a choice. If the Khan crossed the Ugra, he would have to follow the Russian army into a terrain that favored infantry in defensive positions, far from the flat, open spaces where cavalry excelled. Ivan was also buying time, the only commodity that Akhmat Khan no longer possessed. Across the frozen river, Akhmat Khan watched the Russian campfires vanish one by one. To his eyes, it looked like a victory. The Russians were retreating, the way to Moscow was seemingly open. But the Khan did not move. He was paralyzed by a confluence of disasters that Ivan had carefully orchestrated behind the scenes. The first and most pressing was the silence from the west. Akhmat had staked everything on the promised arrival of King Casimir IV of Poland and Lithuania. For months, messengers had galloped between the horde and the Polish court, reaffirming the alliance that would crush Moscow between two hammers. But Casimir never came. Ivan's diplomatic web had tightened around the Polish king. While the Russians stood on the Ugra, Ivan's ally, Mangli Girai, the Khan of Crimea, had launched a devastating raid into the southern territories of Lithuania. Casimir's armies, which were supposed to be marching toward the Ugra to aid Akhmat, were instead tied down defending their own scorched borders. Casimir, facing internal dissent and the very real threat of a Crimean occupation, decided that his alliance with the Golden Horde was a luxury he could no longer afford. He remained in Vilnius, watching the horizon, while Akhmat waited in the snow. The second disaster was the physical condition of the horde itself. The Great Stand had become a slow-motion catastrophe for the Mongol camp. Unlike the Russians, who were operating close to their supply hubs and could bring in grain and salted meat from the nearby towns, the horde was living off the land in a region that had been picked clean. The horses, the lifeblood of the Mongol military machine, were dying in droves. There was no hay, and the deep snow made it impossible for the animals to graze on the frozen grass beneath. A Mongol warrior without a healthy horse was merely an under-equipped infantryman, and by mid-November, thousands of Akhmat's finest riders were walking on foot, their ribs showing through their furs. Moreover, the psychological toll of the raid on Sarai began to permeate the ranks. News had finally reached the camp of the daring riverborne assault by Prince Vasily Nozdravadi and Nurdevlet. The soldiers of the horde learned that their wives, their children, and their treasures in the capital were being put to the sword, while they sat freezing in the Russian mud. The discipline that had held the Mongol Empire for centuries began to fray. Deserters slipped away into the night, risking the wolves and the frost to return to their burning homes. Akhmat Khan was a man trapped between two deaths. If he stayed, his army would starve or freeze to death before the winter was half over. If he crossed the river to pursue Ivan, he would be leading a demoralized, starving force into a prepared defensive position, held by a Russian army that was better fed and better armed. The ice bridge that he had waited for all autumn had turned out to be a bridge to nowhere. He stood on the banks of the Ugra, looking at the abandoned Russian positions, and realized that he had been outmaneuvered without a single major battle being fought. The tension in the Mongol camp reached its breaking point on November 11th. The wind that day was particularly cruel, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke from the Russian towns that seemed so close yet were utterly unreachable. Akhmat Khan, the descendant of Genghis, the man who claimed the title of Grand Khan of the Golden Horde, looked at his shivering generals and gave the order that would change the course of world history. He did not order the charge, he ordered the retreat. The retreat of the Golden Horde was not the disciplined movement of a conquering army. It was a desperate scramble for survival. They turned south, fleeing the bitter Russian winter and the invisible wall that Ivan III had built around his capital. As they moved, they vented their frustration on the Lithuanian lands they passed through, burning the villages of the very king who had failed to show up to support them. It was a final, bitter act of vengeance by a dying empire. Back in Kremenetsk, the Russian scouts brought word to Ivan, the Khan is gone. The news was met with disbelief, then a cautious, burgeoning joy. The stand on the Ugra had ended not with a bang,
but with a silence that echoed across the plains. Ivan III, the man who had been called a coward, had won the most significant victory in Russian history by simply refusing to lose. He had used the river, the weather, and the intricate gears of international diplomacy to dismantle an empire. As the Russian army began its march back toward Moscow, the atmosphere was surreal. They had survived the impossible. The Tatar yoke, the 250-year-old weight of Mongol dominance that had defined the Russian existence, had not been broken by a heroic charge on a field of blood like Kulakova. It had simply dissolved in the frost of the Ugra. But as the bells of Moscow began to ring in the distance, a new question began to form in the minds of the people and the princes alike. The horde was retreating, but they were not yet destroyed. What would happen when the spring thaws came? And what kind of nation would emerge from the shadow of the Khan? The great stand was over, but the birth of an empire was just beginning. Ivan rode at the head of his column, his face a mask of iron. He knew what the people did not yet fully grasp. The world they had lived in for 2 centuries was gone. The Ugra had been the boundary between the past and the future, and they had just crossed it. The frozen river was behind them, and before them lay the vast, uncertain destiny of a sovereign Russia. The air was still cold, the snow still deep, but for the first time in generations, the wind did not smell of tribute and fear. It smelled of the coming change. The final act was not yet finished, but the stage had been cleared. Moscow was no longer a vassal, it was a power, and the echoes of the Ugra were about to resonate across the entire Eurasian continent. The retreat of Akhmat was the first domino to fall in a sequence that would see the map of the world redrawn. But as the Khan's army disappeared into the southern mists, one final, bloody confrontation remained to seal the fate of the Golden Horde forever. The ice had held long enough for history to turn, and now, as the first cracks began to appear in the winter's grip, the legacy of the stand would face its ultimate test.
The flight of the Khan was not the dignified withdrawal of a general who had merely decided to fight another day. It was the frantic scramble of a man who realized, perhaps for the first time, that the mandate of heaven had slipped from his fingers. Akhmat Khan did not simply ride away from the Ugra, he fled into a whirlwind of his own making. As his horsemen retreated toward the southern steppes, they did so with the bitter knowledge that they had arrived as masters and were leaving as ghosts. The Great Horde, the last direct institutional descendant of the empire of Genghis Khan, was unraveling in the cold. To salvage some scrap of prestige, Akhmat's retreating forces turned their frustration upon the borderlands of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. They burned towns and pillaged villages, a vengeful strike against King Casimir IV, whose promised support had never materialized. It was a hollow victory, a desperate act of arson by a landlord who had lost his estate. While the smoke of Lithuanian villages drifted into the winter sky, Ivan III did not rush to celebrate. He was a man of cold calculations and long silences, and he knew that the departure of an army did not always mean the end of a war. He remained cautious, keeping his forces mobilized until he was certain that the threat had truly evaporated. When the Grand Prince finally returned to Moscow, he did not enter through the gates as a conquering hero drenched in the blood of his enemies. Instead, he returned as a man who had outlasted a storm. The chronicles tell us that the people of Moscow met him with a mixture of relief and lingering anxiety. They had lived under the shadow of the Mongol yoke for 240 years. To them, the Ugra was not just a river, it was a psychological threshold. They waited for the sky to fall, for the retribution that had followed every previous act of defiance. But the sky remained silent. The true finality of the stand on the Ugra did not occur on the riverbanks, but in a small, nondescript camp near the mouth of the Don River just a few months later. In January 1481, Akhmat Khan was attempting to regroup, his authority shattered by the failure at the Ugra. He was no longer the terrifying shadow of the east, he was a target. Ibak Khan, the ruler of the Siber Khanate, saw an opportunity that occurs only once in a century. Along with the leaders of the Nogai horde, Ibak launched a midnight raid on Akhmat's camp. There was no grand strategy, no epic clash of civilizations. There was only the quick, muffled violence of a power vacuum being filled. Akhmat was killed in his tent, his life extinguished by the very people who had once been his subordinates. With his death, the Great Horde effectively collapsed as a singular political entity. The center could no longer hold, and the fragments began to drift apart into smaller competing khanates, Kazan, Astrakhan, and the Crimea. The era of the unified steppe empire, which had dictated the pulse of Eurasia for centuries, was over. Back in Moscow, the transformation was profound. The year 1480 became the definitive line between before and after. Ivan III began to use the title of autocrat with a new sense of permanence. He was no longer a vassal prince playing a delicate game of survival. He was the sovereign of a rising state. This shift was not merely political, it was physical. Under the influence of his wife, Sophia Paleologina, the niece of the last Byzantine emperor, Ivan began to reshape Moscow to reflect its new status as the Third Rome. The old wooden fortifications of the Kremlin, which had burned and been rebuilt a dozen times, were replaced by the massive red brick walls and towers that still stand today. Italian architects like Aristotle Fioravanti were brought in to build cathedrals that combined the ancient traditions of Rus with the geometric precision of the Renaissance. These stones were a statement. Moscow was no longer a temporary settlement paying rent to the steppe, it was an eternal city. The historical significance of the Ugra has often been debated by scholars who prefer the drama of a decisive battle like Kulakova. They argue that the stand was boring, a non-event where two armies simply stared at each other until one went home. But in the grand tapestry of history, the Ugra represents the highest form of victory, the win achieved without the ruin of the state. Ivan III had understood something his predecessors had not. He realized that the horde was a machine fueled by fear and tribute. By refusing to provide the tribute and refusing to succumb to the fear, he had starved the machine of its fuel. The stand was a triumph of logistics, diplomacy, and patience. It proved that the yoke was no longer a physical chain, but a memory that only had power if one chose to believe in it. When the ice of the Ugra thickened, Ivan did not see a bridge for his enemies. He saw a mirror reflecting the new reality of his own power. As the 15th century drew to a close, the echoes of the Ugra began to reshape the map of Eastern Europe. The vacuum left by the collapse of the Great Horde allowed Moscow to expand rapidly to the north and east. The gatherer of the Russian lands lived up to his name, absorbing Novgorod, Tver, and Pskov, weaving a patchwork of principalities into a centralized state. The relationship with the Crimean Khanate, which had been a crucial alliance during the Ugra standoff, eventually shifted from partnership to rivalry, but the fundamental balance had changed. Moscow was now the gravity well around which the other fragments of the region orbited. The Great Stand had provided the breathing room necessary for the Muscovite administration to mature, for its laws to be codified in the Sudovnik of 1497, and for a national identity to solidify around the concept of a sovereign Russia. In the centuries that followed, the Ugra River would return to its quiet life as a winding ribbon of water through the Kaluga countryside. Today, the fields where the armies once stood are silent, often blanketed in the same thick mists that confounded the Khan scouts in 1480. There are monuments now, stone markers that tell the story of the Great Stand, but the true monument is the state that grew from that moment of stillness. The Ugra taught the Russian people that sovereignty is not always won with a charge. Sometimes it is won by standing your ground until the world around you changes. It was the moment when the medieval world of fragmented principlines and steppe overlords died, and the modern era of the Russian Empire began to stir in its cradle. The ice eventually melted in the spring of 1481, as it always does. The river flowed again, carrying the remnants of the winter toward the sea. But the world it flowed through was unrecognizable from the one that had frozen the year before. The tribute was gone, the fear was gone, the shadow of the Khan had been replaced by the rising sun of a new power. History is often written in blood, but at the Ugra, it was written in the quiet, steady breath of soldiers waiting for a command that never came because it was no longer needed. The Great Stand on the Ugra River remains one of history's most profound pauses, a moment when the pulse of an entire continent skipped a beat, and when it started again, the rhythm had changed forever. The river remains, the cold remains, but the era of the yoke was washed away by the tide of a new era, leaving behind a legacy of endurance.